We will go ahead and get started with our second briefing on Tropical Storm Nicole. Again, this is Keith Stellman with the National Weather Service here in Atlanta. Not a lot of changes since yesterday. We do have some increases in the overall wind speed, but currently Nicole is over Central Florida, sort of almost off the west coast, but it's nearing the west coast of Florida, north of Tampa. It is expected to make that turn to the north and eventually northeast through the afternoon and the evening. And we are seeing some of the rain bands on the north and the northeast side already impacting parts of South Georgia now. But continued gradual weakening of the storm is expected. However, the rain and wind impacts will remain a concern for us across North and Central Georgia through Friday afternoon. There is some backside wind that we'll see as the storm exits on Friday as well. So a couple things in play with this particular storm, the combination of a very strong pressure gradient. There's actually a strong high pressure sitting up over the northeast United States, similar to the setup we had for Ian. The caveat and the differences between what we had with Ian and us and this particular storm is Ian went further east, so the pressure gradient that set up was further east across South Carolina, North Carolina. This time it's set up more across North Georgia, Central Georgia. And so as a result, we are expecting an extended period of strong gusty winds through tomorrow afternoon. We did hoist a high wind warning for portions of Central Georgia late last night, particularly for wind gusts of 40 to 50 mile an hour potential in that area. And we've had a wind advisory in effect since yesterday for much of the area. The only exception is the far northwest, which I'll get into in some detail as to why that is. But those are for winds gusts of greater than 35 mile an hour across the same time range. We've actually already seen some 30 to 40 mile an hour gusts across the Atlanta metro this morning. The result of that will be likely some down trees and power lines. And obviously, the higher the wind gust, the more likely that is to occur, especially once you start getting into that 40 mile an hour range for an extended period of time. That's when we tend to see a little bit more down trees and power lines. Obviously, that leads to power outages as well. There is still a rainfall threat, particularly this afternoon and the evening. It is a little bit lower, but still widespread 1 to 3 can be expected. The higher amounts will be possible mainly across maybe the north and northwest and the far southeast and the south. The risk for localized flash flooding is greatest again tonight into early tomorrow. It remains a low risk for brief spin-up tornadoes, particularly with the rain bands, and I'll get into some detail with that here in a second. So the latest track, this is the 10 a.m. Update from the Hurricane Center. You can see the storm just northeast of Tampa, expected to go briefly back out over the water or hug the coast, remain a tropical storm coming ashore again south of Tallahassee, and then continue north into central Georgia by tomorrow morning where the center is expected to be. Pretty high confidence in the track. The wind and the rain threat, again, remains our greatest concern. And because the storm is expected to become extratropical, so it goes through a transition once it gets a little further into Georgia of becoming what we call extratropical, not necessarily characterizing tropical impacts, the high sustained winds, etc. The result of that is we opted to go with a high wind warning and wind advisories versus a tropical storm watch or warning. We were not seeing the sustained winds of tropical storm force in any of the forecasts. Not to mention we weren't getting any of that from the Hurricane Center in their forecast as it comes inland. So the result of that is we went with the high wind warning and wind advisory to try and cover the wind gusts that we're expecting. And those wind gusts will be in the tropical storm force, but not the sustained. So the result of that, of greater than 24-hour wind gust duration and the rain, obviously the down trees and power lines, is most likely the biggest impact for us. So the hazards that are in effect across the state, and you can see there's a wide variety of hazards. The high wind warning you can see outlined in yellow, a brighter yellow, basically south and east of the Macon area. all the way down to Vidalia. And that is for the wind gust potential of basically greater than 45 at any point. The greatest threat will be this afternoon into the evening, especially with any of the rain bands that may bring some of those wind gusts down to the surface. The wind advisory, which you can see goes from in Alabama all across Georgia into South Carolina. That's for basically wind gusts of 35 mile an hour or greater. And some of that we've actually already seen across parts of the area. There are tropical storm warnings in effect for parts of Georgia, south of Americus, south of Cordell, say the Albany down to Valdosta, that region of the state. Those are for sustained winds of 35 mile an hour or greater, or should I say 39 mile an hour or greater, and wind gusts over 45. Again, that all falls into Tallahassee, Jacksonville, and even Charleston's forecast area. So the threat levels and confidence, we showed this yesterday. The biggest change was probably on the wind. We tweaked the wind threat up a little bit as the wind gusts have come up in the forecast a tad. And so we now have 50 on the upper end for a little bit larger of an area. Again, but that's mainly across the central part of the forecast area for us, middle Georgia. And then the higher elevations in the mountains, probably 1,500 feet to 2,000 feet and above, could potentially see those 50 mile an hour wind gusts as well, with higher winds aloft off the surface. Rainfall and flooding still remains in the medium range with 1 to 3. Seems pretty localized, at least. We don't have any one particular area we're focused on with rain, but 1 to 3. The clogged drain issue with leaves and debris may cause a little bit more localized flooding than what we would normally see, but that's obviously that threat. River flooding and tornadoes still on the lower end. The 1 to 3, given how dry we've been and the drought that's in place across the region, we're not expecting a lot on the riverside. And then tornadoes, again, I'll touch on in a minute. So let's talk about timing a minute, and this is where I'm going to get into some of the details that I was talking about a minute ago. For northwest Georgia, and keep in mind the degree of impacts are going to vary with this graphic. So the timing and the degree are also in play with this. We're not necessarily highlighting the degree of the impacts. We're just highlighting the timing of what we think will be the worst impacts for you. For northwest Georgia, 2 a.m. to 2 p.m. Friday, and that's with the center as it gets a little bit closer and the rains pick up a little bit. So your greatest impact looks to be mostly heavy rain across far northwest Georgia, and that's the lighter gray shaded area. For the medium gray area in the I-85 corridor, this afternoon through tomorrow afternoon, and those impacts are going to vary across that time range. Winds will be the primary this afternoon. Maybe the tornado threat ekes in there a little bit. It's really mostly confined to wind and potentially heavy rain, but it's going to start out as wind, transition a little bit to heavy rain overnight with some wind, and then a little bit of wind on the backside tomorrow as the storm exits. And so we think the wind gust threat will be highest today and tonight in that middle section, transitioning to maybe a heavy rain threat. Winds will lighten a little bit, and then we'll see the winds on the backside tomorrow. The greatest impact will be in the area shaded in the darker gray from Columbus to Athens and locations south and east. Wind threat highest today, but it will linger into Friday as the storm exits. The winds tomorrow afternoon look like they're going to be the greatest in that region, even tomorrow on the backside. The low-end tornado threat will be greatest there with bands this afternoon, this evening, and brief heavy rain with those bands. So to sort of illustrate this, what I'm going to do is walk you through two different model solutions. What you're looking at are the forecast wind gusts from two different models, computer models, that ran this morning. And we're starting off with about now. Anything in green is 30 to 40. And you start seeing the whites show up down across South Georgia. That's above 40. Not necessarily seeing that yet, but this is to give you an illustration of how the wind threat will evolve with time. I'm going to step forward into this afternoon, see the oranges starting to appear across South Georgia. That's when the 50 mile an hour or tropical storm force winds start coming into play across South Georgia. You know, one model is a little bit greater than the other. The one on the right is a little bit less. But also keep in mind northwest Georgia, you can see our winds, you're actually being blocked by the mountains to your east. And so a lot of those winds aren't making it up into northwest Georgia, which is why we left them out of the wind advisory. But the greens, basically 30 to 40, stay in place across the I-85 corridor, with the winds increasing across South Georgia as the center of the storm, which you can see down south of Tallahassee now, starting to come ashore. And this is about 6 p.m. tonight. And also note, we're starting to see some of these specks of yellow and orange appear up into the I-85 corridor. And that's when we think the wind threat will be greatest across, say, the Metro 85 corridor, that middle section I was showing you on the timing. And then as the storm comes inland, we start to see the 50s dissipate and disappear a little bit, but also note these patches where you see blues next to yellows. Those are the models trying to resolve some of those feeder bands as the center's coming into, say, southwest Georgia, southeast Alabama. Some of those feeder bands are going to start to work in, and those are where some of the stronger winds could mix down to the surface. And again, note, northwest Georgia, still not bringing a lot of wind up there yet, but this is when the rain is starting to come into play. So still see the greens and the whites. Those are 30 to 45 mile-an-hour winds. But note how the stronger winds, the yellows, are starting to disappear. And then as the center moves up across, say, the 85 corridor northwest, you see a lessening of the winds. This is by tomorrow morning. And then the stronger winds remain across south central and southeast Georgia. And then as the system exits, we see some of the stronger winds on the backside of the storm. These greens starting to appear back on the metro. These will be out of the west-northwest as the system exits. So just to give you a full scale how that evolves and why I said the impacts vary with time and with location. That's why, because of the nature of the system. Real quick, I want to jump out to the reflectivity and show the same sort of thing. Get back to it. Let me. There we go. So here's the same thing, but looking at it from a model radar reflectivity standpoint. What I really want to show is some of the heavier rain associated north of the center. You can see that across, say, Albany. But also note the feeder bands coming in off the Atlantic across our east. This is where we think the tornado threat will be greatest. This is by about 6, 7 o'clock tonight. You can see the models trying to resolve these feeder bands. Again, we're looking at two different models, but they're both simulating these feeder bands coming in off the Atlantic. This is where the stronger winds could mix down, and also where the tornado threat might actually exist this afternoon and this evening. For the areas that are back in this rain shield, basically a steady rain with gusty winds mixing in and out, while the feeder band feeds in from the east. So again, speaking to those impacts, and then you see northwest Georgia getting into the mix overnight tonight into tomorrow morning, where the heavy rain comes in north and west of the center. So just wanted to point those things out, jumping out of the slideshow. This what I just went through won't be in the slideshow. It was too difficult to try and show that and demonstrate that, but I wanted to highlight that as part of the timing graphic. Here's the current satellite and radar view. You can see the showers and the bands starting to set up across South and East Georgia. In fact, Jacksonville has already issued several tornado warnings for some of those bands on the north and east side. So that gives us some indication. The other thing of note here is some of this dry air you can see on the satellite loop on the left-hand side working in from the south and east. That's going to help enhance some of those feeder bands and the tornadic threat as it comes inland. It's just going to be a function of, as this storm drifts west and gets into southwest Georgia, how much of that works into our area and works inland into Georgia remains to be seen. Here's another radar simulation. I kind of went through that on the last slide, but you'll see obviously the rain threat increasing with time. Through this one is in the slideshow, so when you download the slideshow, you'll be able to see how that threat increases from south to north through time and then as the system starts to exit. But it looks like everything starts to get out of here by about 2, 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. That seems to be pretty consistent in all the models. Most of the rain gets out of here. There'll still be some good wind on the backside of the storm, but most of the rain is out of here. And the tornado threat really decreases after this evening. Once those feeder bands move out, the tornado threat really decreases significantly. So let's talk about peak winds. Here are the forecast max winds that are our forecast currently. You see a pretty widespread area of 30 to 40 mile an hour peak winds. Note in the 85 corridor, there are some speckles of 40 to 50. Can't rule that out with a few locations. Hartsfield tends to have the highest winds because it's a little elevated location. So can't rule out a 40 to 45 or slightly higher there. The rest of the area, south and east, you can see down near Macon, there's quite a bit more 40 to 50 potential in our forecast. But those persistent gusty winds, most of the day today into tonight, obviously will elevate the risk for downed trees and power lines. And that's what we're talking about because it's going to be persistent through the afternoon, through the evening tonight. As a result, obviously, we have the high wind warning and wind advisory in effect. So the other thing we wanted to talk about is a reasonable worst case. What is the absolute worst case we think is possible? This is a 1 in 10 chance of reaching or exceeding. Basically, it's our 90th percentile wind. You can see pretty broad area, 40 to 50 as a reasonable worst case. This is from all of the model blends. So we're not just making this up. It's coming from all of the guidance that we have combined and looking at some of the worst case scenarios. The most likely time for that to occur would be later this afternoon through tonight as Nicole approaches. And if you think back to the timing slide I just showed a minute ago, you saw a lot of those orange colors start to disappear late tonight into early tomorrow as the storm approaches, as that pressure gradient starts to decrease with the center approaching. The possibility of stronger winds decreases with that. So really it's this afternoon, this evening into the midnight hour or so is when the wind risk will be highest and the possibility for these winds that you're seeing now to occur. Rainfall, widespread 1 to 2, pockets of 3. All areas really have that elevated flash flood risk. It, again, is a little bit lower because of the drought that we've been in, but because of the fall leaves and foliage, we could see quite a few clogged drains and thus backups in areas that may not normally see backups as a result of those clogged drains. Something we run into typically every fall with a rain event. So you can see there, again, widespread 1 to 2. Some enhancements in the mountains and the elevated areas, and then potentially possibly northwest Georgia, to keep an eye on that if you're in the steady rain, if there's any enhancement up there in the northwest, on the northwest side of that center as it approaches and exits. Here is tornado threat. Really hasn't changed a lot since yesterday. In fact, we're basically keeping it generally in the same area. The further south and east you go, particularly down the I-16 corridor and out the I-20 corridor, the greater the risk becomes. Closer to those feeder bands coming in off of the Atlantic side, that's where the threat will be the greatest. And especially if we can see any sun breaking out in between any of those bands, like I was showing on the satellite image with the dry air. So the key takeaways, the high wind warning and the winds, highest today through tonight, and then the possibility for the rainfall and the localized flash flooding, and also the low risk for tornadoes south and east, central Georgia, and down into the south and east areas of Georgia. So this is the final formal webinar and briefing. We're getting ready to spin up our operations side of things as we're expecting the feeder bands to begin to increase later this afternoon into the evening. So we'll have a couple people on radar. At that point, you can obviously reach us in NWS chat, probably the best way to reach us. We'll have more people in ops working operations at that point. But also, you can always call us and ask specific questions if you have specific timing questions for your area. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions.